You see a price, and within milliseconds, your brain evaluates that price, whether it's high or low. Now, what's going on during that process? What makes someone determine whether a price is high or low? Surprisingly, there's a standard process that people follow in all situations. When people see a price, they consciously or non-consciously generate what's known as a reference price, a price that they would expect to pay for that product. And that reference price is based on a combination of factors, such as similar purchases they made in the past or the prices of competing products. Now, if your price is higher than the reference price, then they'll perceive your price to be high. If your price is lower than the reference price, then they'll perceive your price to be low. And it seems like a very simple and intuitive process, and it is. However, when you break down that process, you'll notice some opportunities. In order for people to perceive your price to be low, you need to make your price seem lower than a reference price. And there are 3 ways to do that. The first is when customers pull your price into the comparison with the reference price. There are certain techniques that will cause people to pull a lower price than your actual price. The second place is when people generate the reference price. There are certain techniques that can cause people to generate a higher reference price. And the third place is the actual comparison. There are certain techniques that can make that gap seem larger than it actually is. Later, we'll be looking at specific strategies for each of those situations. For now, let's just dive a bit deeper and talk about how our brains actually conceptualize those numbers and how that plays a role in pricing. Our brain conceptualizes numbers in 3 distinct yet interconnected ways. It's called the triple code model proposed by Stanislas Dehaene, one of the leading researchers in numerical cognition. The first representation is the visual Arabic number, such as 18. This representation helps us with mathematics and calculations. The second representation is the auditory verbal word, so this would be the written version of 18. We associate those words and sounds with that number. And lastly, the third representation is the analog magnitude representation. And this is just an abstract conceptualization of the size and magnitude of that number. All 3 of those factors are integral in numerical cognition. When I was explaining reference prices, I was using the Arabic number form to illustrate. However, in actuality, when your customers are comparing your price to a reference price, they're using all 3 components. And that might not seem important right now, but if you understand that concept, you can trick your customer's brain to perceive your price to be lower. For example, thanks to the analog component, our brains have trouble distinguishing between the visual and numerical size of your price. If you display your price in a smaller font size, customers will perceive your price to be numerically lower because of the interconnected nature of those components. A similar effect occurs with syllables. If you reduce the number of syllables in your price, it'll seem lower in the auditory component and thus lower in the other components. I'll explain those applications later, but that's the underlying cognitive process for how we conceptualize prices and whether we judge them to be high or low.